The gavel struck, sharp and commanding, but it wasn't the sound that froze the room. It was the voice that followed. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Representative Crockett, you are on the verge of sanction." The words were crisp, deliberate, laced with the kind of authority that expected silence to follow. Gasps rippled across the chamber. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting, mouths whispering the same stunned question, did she really just say that? For a moment, the courtroom felt less like a chamber of justice and more like an arena, where power wasn't balanced but wielded like a weapon. Howell's gaze lingered, stern and unflinching. The weight of the robe, the marble walls, the polished seal above her, all symbols of an institution that seemed immovable, unstoppable. Against her, at the defense table, sat Jasmine Crockett. Young, unapologetically bold, a voice that had never softened to fit polite expectations. In that instant, the contrast was searing, one cloaked in centuries of power, the other embodying the restless demand for a new kind of America. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was heavy, charged, as if the entire country had leaned closer to their screens. Social feeds lit up within seconds, clips flashing, captions screaming, judge threatened sanctions. The battle lines were already being drawn outside the courthouse, but inside, time seemed to hang on a knife's edge. And there she was, Crockett, her expression unreadable, her posture unbroken. No fidgeting, no retreat. Just a quiet steadiness, the kind that unnerves those who expect compliance. The imbalance of power was undeniable, but so was the undercurrent. This wasn't just a hearing. This was a clash of eras, a collision between the authority of the bench and the defiance of a generation unwilling to bow. Every whisper in the gallery, every glance exchanged, only deepened the drama. Howell believed she had set the tone, that her threat would quell the storm before it began. But those watching closely sensed something else. Behind Crockett's stillness was not submission, it was calculation. And as the echoes of Howell's warning faded into the charged silence, the unspoken question filled the room, would Crockett bend, or would she rise? But what happened next would flip the script in a way no one saw coming. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like just another tense courtroom exchange, an impatient judge clashing with a sharp-tongued representative. But beneath the surface, this moment carried the weight of something far greater. It wasn't merely about one woman facing the threat of sanctions, it was about who gets to speak, who gets to be silenced, and what it means to challenge the established order in America's most hallowed chambers. Sanctions are no small matter. They are the legal equivalent of a scarlet letter, branding an attorney or lawmaker as reckless, unethical, even unfit. For Jasmine Crockett, a sanction wouldn't just be a technical penalty, it would be ammunition for her critics, headlines for her detractors, and a stain used to undermine everything she represented. It would echo in campaign ads, in late-night commentary, in whispered conversations about whether she was too bold or too unprofessional to be trusted. In one strike of the gavel, Judge Howell had threatened to take years of sacrifice and service and reduce it to a footnote of disgrace. And yet, what Howell might have underestimated was the symbolism playing out. This was not just a courtroom. This was a stage where power met resistance, where the echoes of America's oldest struggles, race, gender, class, were colliding with the polished traditions of authority. For generations, judges had spoken with tones that closed mouths, ended conversations, and forced silence. But Crockett was not a figure molded by deference. She was the daughter of grit, of activism, of communities long told to wait their turn. The political backdrop only sharpened the stakes. The country was already ablaze with debates about accountability, fairness, and who the system truly served. Every headline about power abused, every viral clip of arrogance in authority, had primed the public to see this clash not as a procedural matter but as a symbol. Howell's words weren't just a judicial reprimand, they felt like a command to know your place. And Crockett, seated firmly in that courtroom, embodied every voice unwilling to obey. That's why the air seemed to thicken after Howell's warning. Because everyone understood, if Crockett backed down now, it wouldn't be seen as professionalism. It would be framed as defeat. A sanction would not simply mark her record, it would serve as a warning to others who dared to speak out, a chilling message that power always has the last word. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't built for retreat. She was built for defiance, for standing in spaces where silence was expected and filling them with truth. And that's what made this confrontation so dangerous, so electric, so explosive. Because Crockett wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting to prove that dignity could withstand intimidation, that truth could stare down authority without flinching. The cameras caught every flicker of her expression, every shift of her eyes. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing that the balance of the moment was tipping. Would this be remembered as the day Howell silenced a rising voice, or the day Crockett turned the gavel against the hand that wielded it? The stakes couldn't have been higher: career, credibility, and the very idea of who gets to speak with authority in America. Everyone thought Crockett would fold under pressure. They were wrong. Judge Beryl Howell had spent years cultivating an aura that few dared to question. On the bench, she radiated the confidence of someone who believed the robe itself conferred invincibility. She was seasoned, yes, battle-tested by countless hearings, opinions, and high-profile cases, but that very experience had calcified into something else: overconfidence. The kind that doesn't simply command respect but demands it, even when it hasn't been earned in that moment. In courtrooms across the country, judges are revered as arbiters of fairness. Yet Howell's reputation had begun to drift away from that sacred role. Whispers circulated among legal insiders about her sharpness not just in reasoning but in demeanor. She was known to cut down lawyers mid-sentence, to dismiss arguments with the flick of a hand, to lecture from the bench as though each hearing were her stage. If justice was blind, Howell seemed to believe she could lift the blindfold whenever it suited her. She sat on the bench like a queen unchallenged, one commentator once noted, and the metaphor fit. The robe became a crown, the gavel, a scepter. In her courtroom, authority wasn't shared, it was monopolized. Those who appeared before her understood quickly, this was not a place for equals. This was Howell's dominion. But power has a way of breeding its own blind spots. The more she leaned into her authority, the less she noticed its cracks. Double standards began to appear, subtle at first, then glaring. Attorneys who echoed her preferences found leniency where others were struck down. Arguments that aligned with her leanings received patience, those that didn't were branded as obstruction or disrespect. It was the quiet kind of bias, the sort that's deniable but deeply felt by those on the receiving end. And beyond the courtroom, the controversies gathered like storm clouds. Political observers pointed to rulings that raised eyebrows, decisions that seemed less about blind justice and more about preserving the structures of power. Critics accused her of confusing respect with fear, of wielding intimidation as though it were a tool of jurisprudence. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a portrait of a judge who had forgotten that justice is not performance but principle. Her demeanor fed the perception. Howell's interruptions were legendary, her tone carrying the sharpness of someone who didn't just want clarity but submission. Lawyers described it as walking into a storm with no umbrella. To be on the receiving end of her questions was to feel the sting of an authority that relished its own weight. That arrogance mattered here, because in this particular confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, it was on full display. Howell's threat of sanctions wasn't simply about procedure. It felt personal, pointed, as if she intended to remind everyone in the room who held the power. But in framing it that way, she revealed her own weakness. For every lash of arrogance, for every overstep into intimidation, Howell was creating the conditions for her downfall. The gallery saw it. The viewers at home felt it. It was the sense that Howell had grown too comfortable on her throne, too certain that the robe would shield her from consequence. She believed her authority was unshakable. But history shows that every unshakable authority eventually meets a challenger who refuses to bow. And in Jasmine Crockett, Howell had found exactly that challenger. This wasn't just another lawyer, another legislator to be lectured into silence. This was a woman who had built her career on resistance, who had faced storms fiercer than a gavel strike, who had already learned that dignity means nothing if it can be taken away by fear. Howell had underestimated her opponent, and in that miscalculation lay the seeds of what was about to unfold. Because arrogance blinds the powerful, and Howell was about to be blindsided. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that courtroom, long before cameras captured her calm defiance in the face of a judge's gavel, her story had been written in the language of struggle. She was not born into the kind of power that wears robes or commands chambers. Her power was earned, piece by piece, trial by trial, in neighborhoods where the law often felt like an enemy rather than a shield. As a young law student, Crockett's path was anything but easy. She didn't glide into elite circles cushioned by privilege. She fought her way through with late nights, unrelenting persistence, and an unshakable conviction that law should be about protection, not punishment. While others were drawn to lucrative firms and corporate safety, she chose the harder road: criminal defense, civil rights, cases that forced her to stand shoulder to shoulder with the marginalized and voiceless. To her, every client was more than a file number. They were reminders of how easily dignity could be stripped away when power went unchecked. That conviction carried her from classrooms to the streets. Crockett was never content to be confined by walls of academia or the sterile corridors of the courthouse. She became an activist, her voice rising in protests, town halls, and community meetings where anger boiled against systems that seemed immovable. People noticed her because she refused to whisper when others said, "Wait your turn." They noticed her because when she spoke, it wasn't polished rhetoric, it was raw truth, delivered with the weight of someone who knew the stakes weren't theoretical. Her transition into politics wasn't planned as much as it was demanded. Communities she defended began to see in her a representative, someone who didn't just argue for justice but lived it. And so she ran. Not with the backing of dynasties or the approval of entrenched elites, but with the voices of those who had long been silenced. When she won, it was more than a victory, it was proof that truth, resilience, and authenticity still had a place in American democracy. But Congress was not a sanctuary. It was another battlefield. Committee hearings became arenas of chaos, often designed not to uncover truth but to humiliate, distract, or grandstand. And yet, in those volatile settings, Crockett earned a reputation that set her apart. Where others raised their voices in anger, she raised hers with precision. Where others folded under insult, she responded with piercing calm. Again and again, she showed that chaos did not shake her, it sharpened her. And that is where the stark contrast with Judge Howell becomes undeniable. Howell's authority was inherited from the institution she served, a robe, a title, a gavel. Crockett's authority came from lived struggle, from the long march of experience that taught her dignity must be defended, even when the odds are crushing. Howell could command silence with a glare. Crockett could inspire strength with a word. One was the voice of entrenched power, the other, the voice of restless change. By the time she sat in that courtroom, Crockett was not simply a congresswoman. She was a symbol. A symbol of immigrant families who built lives in a country that often asked for everything and gave back little. A symbol of working-class neighborhoods where justice felt more like survival. A symbol of women of color who had been told for generations that their voices were too loud, too angry, too unrefined to matter. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was carrying the voices of millions who feel silenced. Every glare from Howell, every sharp word of intimidation, landed not just on her but on the millions watching who knew that feeling of being told, "Sit down. Stay quiet. Know your place." But Crockett had never known her place. She had only known her purpose. And so, when Howell leveled her threat of sanction, expecting deference, expecting retreat, she met a woman who had walked through storms much darker than the shade of a judicial robe. Crockett's silence in that moment wasn't fear, it was calculation. Her steady posture wasn't compliance, it was resistance. Those who knew her journey could see what was coming. They had seen it before, the moment when an insult meant to crush became fuel for her fire. The moment when institutional power collided with the lived force of resilience and dignity. The moment when history shifted, not because of titles, but because of truth. And when the gavel came down, Crockett's response shocked everyone in the room. The air in the courtroom thickened like a storm cloud refusing to burst. Every tick of the clock echoed like a drumbeat, each second stretching the tension tighter. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her gavel gripped like a weapon, her eyes narrowing as if daring Jasmine Crockett to falter. Her tone sharpened with each word, cutting through the chamber like the clang of iron on stone. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said slowly, deliberately, "this court will not tolerate disruptions. If you continue down this path, sanctions will follow." The word sanctions carried weight, an unspoken promise of humiliation, a threat designed to bend even the boldest into submission. But Jasmine Crockett did not bend. While Howell's words struck like arrows, Crockett's body language told a different story. She sat still, her hands folded neatly before her, her chin raised just enough to signal defiance without breaking composure. Her calm was not the quiet of fear but the stillness of a mountain before an avalanche. The audience at home, viewers glued to screens, political junkies and ordinary citizens alike, leaned closer. In living rooms, in office cubicles, even in crowded cafes, people whispered to each other. Is she really threatening her like that? How is Crockett not flinching? This is unbelievable. Judge Howell, seasoned and sharp, pressed on. She wielded her authority like a hammer, pounding at Crockett with layered insults disguised in judicial language. Words like decorum and respect for the institution spilled from her lips, but beneath them lurked accusation, as though Howell was declaring Crockett unworthy of the seat she held. Every phrase carried the subtle poison of condescension. It was the language of power reminding the powerless to know their place. Yet in this room, the script wasn't playing out as Howell intended. Because Jasmine Crockett's silence, her refusal to squirm or shrink, was louder than any gavel strike. Her stillness unnerved Howell. It was like a predator finding its prey staring back, unblinking, unafraid. The imbalance of power was supposed to make this easy. Howell had the bench, the robe, the authority. Crockett had only her voice and her presence. But sometimes presence is enough to tip the scale. The imagined audience felt it too. On social media, fingers were already flying across keyboards. This is intimidation, plain and simple. Crockett is holding her ground like a champ. Howell doesn't realize she's making this worse for herself. Each new word from Howell was another nail hammered into her own coffin of credibility. Her voice rose, and the veneer of impartiality cracked. She sounded less like a judge maintaining order and more like a monarch fending off rebellion. Crockett finally shifted, just slightly. A lean forward, her eyes steady, her breathing measured. To the untrained observer, it was nothing. But to those who knew, it was the signal that the tide was about to turn. The breaking point was here. The audience at home could almost feel it through the screen, as if they were seated in that courtroom, their hearts beating in rhythm with the rising tension. Howell thought she had cornered Crockett. She believed the sanction threat would force submission, silence, apology. But silence does not always mean surrender. It can mean strategy. And Crockett, calm as the eye of a hurricane, was waiting for her moment. The gavel loomed, ready to strike, when Crockett leaned forward, her voice poised to slice through the chamber. And with words so measured, so piercing, she froze the entire room. Cliffhanger. But instead of retreating, Crockett leaned forward with words that froze the entire chamber. For several long seconds, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The gavel's echo had faded, but Judge Beryl Howell's words still hung in the air like a storm cloud. The sanction threat wasn't just a legal rebuke, it was a challenge, a test of willpower, and a calculated attempt to break the rhythm of Jasmine Crockett's momentum. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't even twitch a muscle. Instead, she leaned forward ever so slightly, her calm presence magnified by the storm raging around her. The cameras trained on her face captured not panic, not defeat, but resolve. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't raised, nor was it rushed. It was steady, deliberate, every word chosen like a sharpened blade. "Your Honor," she began, the respectful address landing with the weight of both courtesy and defiance, "I must remind this court that sanctions are not weapons to silence the elected representatives of the people. They are tools reserved for misconduct, conduct that undermines the very integrity of justice. And what I've done here today does neither." Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't just the words, it was the precision. Crockett wasn't lashing out with raw emotion, she was constructing an argument brick by brick, laying down precedent as though she'd anticipated this very strike long before it came. She continued, citing chapter and verse of case law, precedents where courts had ruled that sanctions could not be wielded as tools of intimidation. She invoked the very language of the judiciary's own codes of conduct, reminding Howell, and everyone listening, that the bench was bound by duty just as tightly as the bar. "Silencing me," Crockett pressed on, "would not simply be silencing Jasmine Crockett. It would be silencing the very constituents who placed me in this position to ask questions, to demand answers, to represent their voice in these proceedings. If this courtroom becomes a place where questions from an elected official are treated as offenses rather than rights, then it is not me who stands in violation of decorum, but the very system itself." For a heartbeat, the room froze. Cameras zoomed in. Members of the audience leaned forward, their eyes wide. Even some of Howell's clerks glanced at each other nervously. Crockett's calm delivery was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the voice of rebellion, it was the voice of principle. And then came the pause, the kind of pause directors of courtroom dramas dream of. Crockett stopped speaking, folded her hands, and allowed silence to do the rest of the work. The silence itself was an indictment, forcing every person in the chamber to sit with the weight of her words. Whispers began. Some in the gallery covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. Reporters scribbled frantically, already knowing the headlines were writing themselves. On social media, clips of her rebuttal were being clipped, shared, captioned, dissected in real time. Judge Howell, for the first time, appeared unsettled. She shifted in her seat, glanced down at her notes, then back up. The mask of impenetrable authority had slipped, if only slightly. But in politics, and in spectacle, that slight slip was everything. Crockett leaned in again, her voice softening but cutting even deeper. "You can sanction me, Your Honor. You can attempt to brand my words as improper. But what you cannot do is erase the truth that's been spoken. What you cannot do is convince the American people that asking questions, questions rooted in law, in precedent, in fairness, is an act of defiance. Because the people are watching. And they understand that intimidation, no matter how cloaked, is still intimidation." A murmur surged through the courtroom like a wave. Some in attendance nodded, others sat stiff, unsure of how to react. Howell's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came immediately. The judge's authority, once so towering, seemed to wobble on its foundation. The cinematic beats were unmistakable. A close-up of Crockett's composed expression. A quick cut to Howell fidgeting. Another shot of the audience, eyes wide, jaws clenched. Somewhere, a phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. Even Crockett's critics, those who had dismissed her as brash or disruptive in past hearings, were caught off guard. They expected fire, they got discipline. They expected anger, they got precision. They expected collapse, they got control. It was a mic drop moment, not because she shouted, but because she didn't have to. The silence stretched again, longer this time, until it was broken only by the sound of cameras clicking. Howell finally cleared her throat, but it was clear she was on the defensive now, her earlier sharpness dulled by Crockett's rhetorical strike. And outside the courtroom, the response was immediate. Hashtags began to trend. Commentators scrambled to get airtime. Supporters flooded social platforms with messages of solidarity. She stood her ground. She spoke for all of us. This is why she's there. Crockett, in that moment, wasn't just a congresswoman under fire. She was the embodiment of millions who had been told to sit down, to be quiet, to accept the authority of systems that so often seemed stacked against them. The villain had crumbled, not in a dramatic outburst, but in the quiet, undeniable recognition that the balance of power had shifted. Howell's authority, though intact on paper, had been pierced in the court of public opinion. And once pierced, it could not be repaired. But the true impact of Crockett's words would not be measured in that room alone. Because even as the courtroom's silence deepened, outside, the world was already erupting. Cliffhanger, but the impact didn't end inside the courtroom. Outside, the world was already erupting. The moment Crockett's words left her lips, the courtroom seemed suspended in a rare kind of disbelief. But outside, the storm hit immediately. Social media erupted as though the world had been waiting for this spark. Hashtags trended within minutes, hashtag Crockett stands tall, hashtag justice spoken, hashtag mic drop moment. Every tweet, every post, carried a mix of awe, admiration, and a collective sense of validation. Memes appeared almost instantly, juxtaposing Howell's frown with Crockett's composed determination, captions mocking arrogance and celebrating courage. Within hours, videos of the exchange had been clipped, re-uploaded, and shared across platforms. Each play, each share, amplified the drama, transforming a single courtroom clash into a national spectacle. Celebrities weighed in, some with subtle praise, others with outright admiration. From late-night hosts to prominent politicians, the message was clear: this wasn't just another hearing. Crockett had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the marble walls of the courthouse. Interviews replayed the mic drop moment repeatedly, each replay highlighting the calm, measured precision of her rebuttal. News anchors dissected her language, her timing, even her posture, framing her response as a textbook example of dignity meeting intimidation. Supporters poured into comment sections and feeds, celebrating Crockett not merely as a politician, but as a symbol of resistance and poise. Finally, someone who speaks truth to power, read one viral post. "This is the representation we've been waiting for," said another. Her victory was no longer just personal, it belonged to every voice that had been silenced, marginalized, or dismissed by systems meant to serve them. Critics, on the other hand, scrambled to reframe the narrative. Some tried to paint her confidence as arrogance, her composure as theatrics. Others questioned the propriety of her language, attempting to turn public scrutiny against her. But the rhythm of public opinion had shifted, the calculated power of Crockett's words had created momentum that few could resist, and fewer still could reverse. Commentators on cable news and online forums quickly framed the event as something larger than a courtroom spat. It became a lens through which broader questions of power, justice, and representation were examined. Was this the moment where institutional authority began to face real accountability? Could one woman's courage alter the tone of political and judicial engagement? Every angle suggested that what had happened in that room was more than procedural, it was symbolic. Even casual viewers felt the ripple. Dinner tables became discussion stages, car rides transformed into commentary sessions, and online forums buzzed with analysis, memes, and praise. People shared clips with friends and family, insisting that others witness the calm dismantling of intimidation, the rare spectacle of reason prevailing over force. The story became a teaching moment, an inspiration, and a conversation starter, all in one. The effect on Howell was undeniable. Analysts speculated on the psychological impact, noting that a public rebuke, even if procedural, can carry weight far heavier than a courtroom ruling. The judge's authority had been challenged, and the challenge had been validated on a massive, visible stage. What happened in those minutes would be referenced in legal circles, political commentaries, and social media discussions for months to come. And yet, amid the viral clips, trending hashtags, and endless commentary, a deeper truth began to crystallize. This wasn't only about Crockett winning an argument. It wasn't only about Howell being unsettled. It was about power itself, how it is wielded, how it is resisted, and how it can be transformed in the moment one refuses to be silenced. The room may have emptied, the gavel may have returned to its stand, and Howell may have tried to reclaim composure, but outside, the echoes of that confrontation refused to fade. They reverberated in feeds, screens, and conversations everywhere. Every retweet, every shared clip, every meme carried a subtle but undeniable message: authority can be challenged, and courage can inspire a movement. And as the noise grew louder, one truth became impossible to ignore. In the aftermath of the courtroom storm, the narrative shifted. What had begun as a confrontation between a judge and a congresswoman had evolved into something far larger, a story about dignity, resilience, and the unyielding refusal to be silenced. Crockett's words, measured, precise, and unwavering, had transformed a potential humiliation into a lesson for every viewer, every citizen watching from home. Dignity cannot be sanctioned, she had said, and in that statement lay a truth both simple and profound. Authority can threaten, intimidate, even punish, but it cannot strip the inherent worth of those who speak with conviction and integrity. Crockett had reminded the world that true power is not derived from robes or titles, but from courage, principle, and steadfastness. And she didn't stop there. Silence is not compliance, she continued, her voice carrying the resonance of millions who had long felt voiceless. For every person who had ever been told to sit down, to wait their turn, to accept injustice quietly, her words were a rallying cry. They were a signal that the system may attempt to control, but it cannot erase the truth, nor can it extinguish the fire of those who refuse to be diminished. The courtroom drama had faded into history, but the lessons remained vivid. Crockett's response reframed the attack. It was no longer about a sanction, or a clash of personalities, or even a single courtroom. It was about resilience, the quiet power that grows when courage meets intimidation. Every act of arrogance, no matter how polished or entrenched, inevitably underestimates the resilience of those who stand with principle. And the crescendo of this moment was not just emotional, it was universal. Crockett's defiance resonated far beyond partisan lines, inspiring those who saw themselves reflected in her struggle. She became more than a congresswoman defending herself. She became a symbol for every American who refuses to be sidelined, for every voice insisting that justice and fairness are not privileges but rights. The impact rippled through households, offices, classrooms, and online communities. Parents shared the clip with children to demonstrate courage in the face of authority. Teachers used it as an example of standing by one's principles, of defending dignity even when the stakes are high. Citizens discussed it in forums, breaking down every word, every pause, every calm gesture, noting how the smallest acts of poise can dismantle the weightiest threats. And in the quiet reflection that followed, a larger lesson emerged: arrogance always underestimates resilience. Those who rely solely on power to command obedience forget that integrity, preparation, and courage can flip the narrative in an instant. Howell's attempt to intimidate had backfired, not because Crockett was aggressive, but because she was deliberate, principled, and unshakable. This was the kind of inspiration that transcends politics. It reminded viewers that standing tall is not about defeating another person, it's about affirming the values that define a just society. Justice, fairness, dignity, Americanness, these were not abstract ideals anymore, they were embodied in a moment that millions witnessed. Crockett had shown that refusing to be silenced is itself a declaration of freedom, a testament to the enduring strength of those who believe in the power of their voice. As the echoes of that courtroom clash lingered, one thing became undeniably clear: this wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's victory. It was a victory for every individual who has faced intimidation, every person told to compromise their dignity, and every citizen who believes that justice and truth should never be muted. Her story left the nation with a simple but unforgettable truth: when courage meets principle, no gavel, no threat, and no system can suppress the voice of righteousness. And in that truth, every American found a reflection of what it means to stand tall, speak boldly, and claim their rightful place in the narrative of freedom. Judge Howell attempted to sanction Jasmine Crockett, but her next move left history stunned. What seemed like a routine courtroom clash became a defining moment, not just for one congresswoman, but for the millions who saw themselves reflected in her courage. The gavel that was meant to intimidate only amplified the power of her voice, reminding the world that dignity cannot be threatened and truth cannot be silenced. This was more than a courtroom drama. It was a lesson in moral clarity. Arrogance may wield authority, but it cannot extinguish integrity. Power may demand obedience, but it cannot suppress principle. In standing firm, Crockett showed that real strength lies not in titles or robes, but in the unwavering commitment to speak truth, defend justice, and uphold dignity. Every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word in that moment became a symbol. For the young, the marginalized, and the overlooked, it was proof that standing tall matters, that refusing to be silenced matters, and that courage, measured and principled, can shift narratives in ways authority never anticipates. If you believe voices like Crockett's deserve to be heard, join us. Subscribe, share, and be part of this movement for dignity and justice. Spread the story, carry the lesson forward, and remind the world that standing for what is right is never just an individual act, it's a collective declaration that courage, truth, and resilience will always have their place in shaping America's story. This isn't just a victory for one woman in a courtroom. It's a reminder that each of us has the power to speak, to resist, and to inspire. And in that power lies the promise of a future where integrity triumphs over intimidation, and where every voice matters.